They told me to ask my daughter for money. My own son had $12 million sitting in an Atlanta private wealth account, and his mother told me to go ask the fourth-grade schoolteacher instead. That is the kind of sentence that sits in your chest like a jagged stone you swallowed whole, heavy enough to bleed you dry from the inside out. I didn't say a single word back to Evelyn that night. I'm 58 years old, my hands are calloused, and my back aches every time the southern humidity rolls over the Georgia pines. I just sat there at a chipped formica table, listening to the quiet hum of an aging refrigerator, wondering how 31 years of marriage could shrink down into a cold, hollow room where my existence was nothing more than an inconvenience. Before I tell you about the hospital or the document that broke my family in two, I want you to understand who I am. My name is Hank Sterling. I live in a weathered, single-story house off Highway 16 down in Noonan, Georgia. It's the sort of place you buy when you're 26, full of big dreams and cheap paint, telling your young wife that you'll flip it for a profit in 5 years. That 5-year plan dissolved a long time ago. Today, the wooden rail on the front porch is rotting through. The pine straw in the yard is overgrown, and the gutter on the east side has been sagging for 2 years straight. I work 6 days a week driving a heavy diesel forklift at a distribution warehouse over in Peachtree City. Most nights, I come home smelling of wet cardboard, hydraulic fluid, and exhaust fumes, stepping out of a silver Ford F-150 that's got 210,000 miles on the engine, and a rusted fender that rattles like a tin can every time I hit 50 miles an hour. It was a suffocating Tuesday evening in late July. The heat down here in Coweta County doesn't die when the sun goes down. It just thickens, hanging in the dark air until the cicadas in the oak trees scream so loud you can hear them over the noise of the ceiling fan. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of mail I'd been avoiding for 3 days. There was a final disconnect notice from Georgia Power printed in bright red ink, alongside a thick white envelope from the insurance company that I already knew held bad news. Good news down here doesn't come in envelopes that thick. Across the counter, Evelyn's phone buzzed, vibrating hard against the laminate surface. I watched her whole face transform in a split second. The weary scowl she'd worn around me for 10 years vanished, replaced by a radiant smile. "Mason, oh honey," Evelyn practically sang into the receiver, her voice dropping into that sweet southern drawl she reserved exclusively for people who mattered. "Oh, my sweet lord, tell me everything." I set my lukewarm coffee cup down. "Is that Mason?" I asked softly. "Put him on speaker for a second, Evie. Let me just tell him hey." Evelyn didn't even glance my way. Instead, she turned her body completely around, pivoting her shoulders like I was a foul draft blowing through a window she desperately needed to shut. She walked toward the living room, cradling the phone like it was made of solid gold. "A $12 million commission account?" Evelyn gushed, her laugh echoing off the hallway walls. "Mason, that is— oh, I am so proud of you, baby. 12 million. You got that brilliant mind for business straight from my side of the family. Your grandfather could sell ice to an Eskimo, God rest his soul. I always knew you were meant for Buckhead, not some dusty warehouse town." I sat frozen at that table, listening to my wife praise our 31-year-old son like he'd single-handedly cured disease, simply because he'd closed a private equity deal in downtown Atlanta. To Evelyn, money wasn't just currency, it was righteousness. It was the only metric that determined whether a human being deserved to breathe the air in her room. Eventually, the call ended. Evelyn walked back into the kitchen, but the very moment her eyes landed on me, that glowing smile dropped off her face like a porcelain mask slipping off a wall. The cold contempt settled right back into her eyes. "He's doing so well, Hank," she said flatly. "That's real good, Evie," I answered quietly. "I'm glad for the boy." She didn't ask how my shift went. She didn't ask about the deep, rattling cough I'd been trying to hide for 3 weeks. Instead, she pulled out the red-stamped electric bill and slid it across the table until it hit my mug. "Fix this," she spat out. "Fix it before they cut the power off again." I looked down at the bill, then raised my eyes to look at her left hand. Her ring finger was completely bare. For 6 months, she'd been wearing a cheap silver band from Walmart, claiming to everyone at church that she'd lost her engagement ring down the drain while washing dishes. I'd spent months carrying a heavy knot of guilt in my stomach, blaming myself because I couldn't afford a plumber or a replacement. I didn't know then what I found out later. Evelyn hadn't dropped that ring down any drain. 6 months prior, when Mason was struggling to fit in with wealthy young brokers in Atlanta, Evelyn had secretly taken her gold engagement ring. The ring I worked double shifts at a lumber yard in 1993 to buy her, straight to a pawn shop in Columbus. She'd hawked it for $1,200 cash and wired every penny to Mason so he could buy a tailored Italian suit for a party in Buckhead. She'd let me carry the crushing guilt for half a year, letting me believe I was a failure who couldn't keep a ring on his wife's finger, all to fund our son's vanity. "I'll take care of the bill on Friday, Evelyn," I said softly. Swallowing the lump in my throat, she just turned her back on me again, leaving me alone with the buzz of the cicadas outside. Now, here is the part where I'm supposed to make myself look better than I am, but I won't do that. I'm going to tell you the cold truth, because the truth is far worse than anything I could make up, and it's the only thing that matters here. 10 years ago, I wasn't some deadbeat who gambled away his family's savings at a casino down in Biloxi. I was a real estate investor, a small-time operator, sure, but I was good at what I did. I had a sharp eye for land and I worked myself to the bone. Back in 2014, I scraped together every single penny I had, leveraged my credit to the hilt, and bought 80 acres of raw pine-wooded land out in Fayette County. It was a calculated risk, but a brilliant one. That land was sitting directly in the projected path of the Interstate 85 highway expansion. Everyone in Coweta County told me I was a genius. Evelyn used to brag about her visionary husband to her circle at church every single Sunday morning. Then the sky caved in. An old industrial chemical storage tank on a neighboring commercial property ruptured underground. Toxic solvents bled silently into the water table before anybody even realized what was happening. My 80 acres, the land I'd sunk my life savings, my reputation, and my family's entire future into, was instantly locked down under a federal cleanup order issued by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I couldn't sell it. I couldn't build on it. I couldn't do a damn thing with it except pay the exorbitant annual property taxes while watching my credit score circle the drain. The banks pulled my commercial lines of credit overnight. My business partners walked away without looking back. And Evelyn? Evelyn never once asked if I was holding up okay under the pressure. She just stood in our living room, crossed her arms, and demanded to know how I was going to fix the disaster I dragged her into. Ever since that day, I've been driving a diesel forklift at a shipping warehouse off Highway 34 in Peachtree City. 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, coming home every night smelling of wet cardboard, hydraulic fluid, and old diesel fuel. Somewhere in the middle of all that ruin, my son Mason turned 21. Instead of understanding the catastrophe that had hit us, he decided his entire young adult life was ruined because his daddy couldn't afford to fund his junior year spring break trip to Panama City Beach. He never forgave me for that, not once. Not even after I sat him down at the kitchen table and explained the federal EPA hold in plain English. In his mind, I was a gambler who lost, and he was the innocent victim paying the price. Maybe he just needed a villain to blame for his own insecurities, and I was standing right there in work boots. The true poison of his resentment became crystal clear just 3 months ago. Mason called Evelyn while I was washing up at the kitchen sink after a grueling 12-hour shift. He had put the call on speakerphone from his luxury high-rise apartment in Buckhead. I heard a snickering female voice in the background, his wealthy Atlanta girlfriend, Savannah. "Is that your dad I hear breathing heavily in the background?" she sneered, her voice dripping with vanity. "He sounds like a tired old warehouse truck driver who smells like engine oil." I froze, my hands dripping soapy water into the sink. Instead of defending the man who had worked his hands to the bone to feed him, Mason just let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Yeah, that's him." Mason chuckled into the speaker, loud enough for me to hear every word. "Some guys are just born to stay at the bottom of the food chain, babe. My daughter, thank God, was cut from an entirely different cloth. Clara is 26, a 4th grade school teacher over at an elementary school in Noonan, about a 15-minute drive from my place. She was 16 when the EPA shut my land down. She was old enough to remember the nice house we used to dream about, but young enough to watch her father rebuild a life out of absolute nothing instead of just mourning what was lost. 2 nights after Mason's phone call, Clara came by my weathered house carrying a warm foil pan of homemade chicken and biscuits, my absolute favorite. Heavy on black pepper and southern gravy the way my own mother used to bake it. She didn't say a single word about money, bills, or Mason's $12 million account. She just set the steaming pan down on the table, kissed the top of my graying head, and listened as a violent, rattling cough racked my chest. She crossed her arms, her soft brown eyes narrowing with deep concern. "You still coughing like that, old man?" she asked quietly. "It's just allergies, baby," I lied, trying to clear my throat. "Uh-huh," Clara said, leaning against the counter. "You're seeing Dr. Vance this Thursday afternoon. Don't argue with me, Hank Sterling." I didn't argue. There wasn't any point in arguing with Clara. She'd inherited her stubbornness from somewhere, and I had a strong suspicion it came straight from me. Dr. Vance wasn't smiling when he walked back into the small exam room at the Peachtree City Medical Center. He didn't sit down right away. He just set a thick manila folder down on the counter like it weighed 50 pounds. "Hank, I'm not going to sugarcoat this," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "The scan showed a mass on your lower left lung. It's operable, and that's the good news, but it needs to come out soon. We're talking weeks, Hank, not months." There it was, the other shoe dropping with a heavy final thud. I stared at the chart, my chest tightening. Okay, I said, because what else do you say when a doctor hands you a clock ticking down on your life? So, let's schedule it. That was when the woman from hospital billing walked in, a polite lady named Becky, who looked about as uncomfortable as a human being could look. She held a clipboard and explained that because of a gap in my warehouse insurance plan for this specific surgical procedure, there was an out-of-pocket deposit required before they could even book the operating room. $3,500, Becky whispered softly. We can look into setting up a long-term payment plan for the remainder of the bill, Mr. Sterling, but the surgical team requires that initial deposit up front to secure the OR slot and the specialist. It's hospital policy. $3,500. I used to make more than that in a single week back before the EPA locked down my land. Now I walked out to the parking lot and sat inside my silver Ford F-150, the rusty frame shaking while the engine idled rough. I did the math 5 different ways in my head, and every single time the answer came out the same. I didn't have it. My credit was still trash from 10 years of property tax debt on the Fayette County land. No bank in Coweta County was going to approve a loan for a warehouse forklift driver. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at a $3,500 death sentence. And I had a 31-year-old son sitting on $12 million in an Atlanta bank account. I told myself I wouldn't call him. I told myself that for 2 whole days. But a father swallows his pride when his life is on the line. You call your son and you pray to God that beneath all the fancy suits, he's still your boy. I dialed Mason's phone on Thursday afternoon. He picked up on the 4th ring and I could hear the background noise immediately. Crystal glasses clinking, loud laughter, and a waiter describing a cut of Wagyu steak. They were at an upscale steakhouse in Buckhead. Dad, hey, can this wait? Mason snapped into the receiver. We're celebrating the closing of the Hendricks account. Mason, please, I said, my voice trembling. I need to talk to you about something life-threatening. The doctor found a mass on my lung. I need emergency surgery within weeks. The hospital requires a $3,500 deposit to book the operating room, or they won't put me on the schedule. There was a long pause on the line. For one brief, foolish second, I thought maybe he'd soften. Then his voice turned ice cold. I just spent 10 years digging myself out of the hole your bad real estate investments put this family in. Mason sneered, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. You know how hard I worked to get where I am in Atlanta, and now you want me to throw my hard-earned commission into your bad planning? Ask the hospital for a payment plan, Dad. I've got a reputation and a social status to protect now. I can't keep carrying your dead weight. Before I could even speak, I heard his girlfriend, Savannah, giggle in the background. Ooh, babe, is the $1,200 bottle of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon here yet? She cooed loudly into his microphone. Post a picture of the bottle on Instagram first. Mason didn't hesitate. He dropped $1,200 on a single bottle of bourbon to show off for his wealthy friends on social media, while telling his own father that $3,500 to cut cancer out of his chest was dead weight. Don't call me for money again, Dad. Mason said coldly, and the line went dead. When I called Evelyn right after, hoping she'd reason with him, she just yelled into the speaker. Don't you dare ruin his celebration with your pity stories, Hank. He worked hard to get away from your mess. Clara's got a steady teaching job, doesn't she? Go ask your daughter. I hung up, leaning my forehead against the truck's cold steering wheel in that hospital parking lot, weeping in silence as the hot Georgia sun beat down on the windshield. 2 days after that crushing phone call, I met Clara at a small, weathered diner off Highway 16 in Noonan, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and a tired waitress who calls everybody hun. I hadn't planned on asking her for a single penny. I really hadn't. I was going to sit there, smile, eat my fried catfish, and pretend everything was fine. But a daughter like Clara knows. She set her fork down before I could even take 2 bites of my food. Dad, she said, her voice quiet but firm as she looked me dead in the eye. What's wrong? Tell me right now. I swallowed hard, ashamed to even look at my 26-year-old daughter. How does a 58-year-old father explain that his son's sitting on $12 million turned his back on him, leaving him to beg a schoolteacher for his life? Before I could even stumble through a sentence, Clara reached into her canvas bag and slid a thick white envelope across the Formica table. Right beside it, she placed her phone face up. On the screen was an approval notification from a high-interest payday lender, $1,500 at a brutal 22% interest rate. Stop talking, Dad, Clara whispered. Her eyes were wet with tears, but her jaw was locked tight with determination. There's $2,000 cash in that envelope. I sold my Civic this morning. My throat closed up so tight I couldn't breathe. Clara, baby, I choked out, my hands shaking over the envelope. You sold your car? How are you going to get to work? She reached across the table and grabbed my calloused hand hard, the way you hold on to something you refuse to let fall. Cars can be replaced, Dad. You can't, she said, fighting back a sob. I'm taking the city bus from the square at 6:40 every morning. It's fine, I need the exercise anyway. I sat in that vinyl booth and wept right there in front of half the lunch crowd. The daughter nobody bragged about at church, the daughter who didn't have millions in Buckhead, had just sacrificed her independence to buy her father a second chance at life. The surgery took place on a crisp Thursday morning at Georgia General. The last image I had before the anesthesia pulled me into darkness was Clara's face leaning over my gurney, her small hand squeezing my fingers tight. "You're too stubborn to die today, old man," she whispered with a brave smile. When I woke up 6 hours later in the recovery ward, Dr. Vance was standing over me. The mass on my lower left lung had been completely removed with clean margins. The surgery was an absolute success. 2 weeks later, while I was recovering on Clara's pull-out couch in her small one-bedroom apartment off the Grand Parkway, I looked up at her refrigerator. Taped right next to a picture of us at a 4th of July picnic was the local city bus schedule, with 6:40 a.m. circled in red marker. Every single morning, while my son drove a leased luxury sports car around Atlanta, my 26-year-old daughter walked to the bus stop in the sweltering Georgia heat to teach 4th graders, all to pay back a loan that saved my life. I stared at that schedule, my chest aching worse than my surgical incision, and swore a silent, solemn vow. If I have to break my own back, I will repay every drop of her blood, sweat, and tears tenfold. Then came the afternoon that turned my heart to iron. It was a scorching Tuesday, 95 degrees with 90% humidity. Clara came home an hour late, her face pale as ash, her clothes damp with sweat, and an ice pack pressed to her forehead. A coworker had driven her home. When I pressed her, the truth came out. Clara had been skipping lunches to save money for my heart-healthy groceries, and after walking 3 blocks to the bus stop under the blazing southern sun, her body gave out. She had fainted right there on the concrete sidewalk, her knees scraped and bloodied from the fall. I held my trembling daughter on that small sofa, watching her drift off to sleep from sheer exhaustion. As I looked at her bruised knees and thought of Mason ordering $1,200 bottles of bourbon in Buckhead, the last trace of fatherly leniency inside me died. The debt of gratitude I owed my daughter was absolute, and the reckoning awaiting my son and wife was going to be total. 16 days after my surgery, while I was still resting on Clara's pull-out couch, moving slow and guarding my healing ribs, the mail carrier knocked on the apartment door instead of just dropping the daily mail in the box. Clara was at school teaching her 4th graders. I answered the door in my faded bathrobe, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Got 2 certified letters here for Hank Sterling," the carrier said, holding an electronic keypad out for my signature. "Requires a signature, sir." I signed my name with a shaky hand, took the white envelopes, and walked back to Clara's small kitchen table. The first envelope bore a seal I recognized instantly, a seal that had haunted my dreams every single night for 10 straight years. The United States Environmental Protection Agency. My heart sank down into my stomach. Here it comes, I thought to myself, letting out a heavy sigh. Another 10-year update. Another form letter telling me the soil cleanup is still ongoing, telling me not to touch the pine trees, not to build, and not to hope. I almost set it aside on the counter to avoid the heartbreak. But something inside me forced my fingers to tear open the thick envelope. I pulled out the document and read the first paragraph. Then I read it again, slower this time, my eyes tracing every single black line on the white paper, because I simply didn't trust what my brain was seeing. Environmental remediation status complete. Site released from federal oversight effective July 14th. Complete. Done. After 10 agonizing years of paying crippling property taxes on land I couldn't step foot on, 10 years of my credit score rotting in the gutter, 10 years of my wife looking at me like I was a parasite that had ruined her life. It was over. The land was clean, fully released. I set the EPA letter down on the laminate table like it was a piece of live dynamite that might explode if I moved too fast. My hands were trembling violently as I picked up the second envelope. The return address read, Cornerstone Commercial Properties, Atlanta, Georgia. I tore it open. It turned out that while my 80 acres of raw pine woods had been locked down under federal environmental restrictions, the Interstate 85 highway expansion I had gambled my entire life on a decade ago had finally been completed. A brand new commercial interchange sat less than half a mile from my property line. 80 acres of once worthless, chemical-stained land were now sitting right in the bullseye of the hottest commercial real estate corridor in South Metro Atlanta. Cornerstone's letter wasn't a casual inquiry or a lowball feeler. It was a formal, binding acquisition offer signed by their corporate vice president. $15 million cash, 30-day closing window. I read that figure, $15 million, at least 20 times. 3 weeks ago, I was crying in a vinyl diner booth off Highway 16 because I couldn't come up with $3,500 for a lung operation. And now, I was sitting alone in a school teacher's tiny apartment holding $15 million in my trembling hands. I looked up from the paper, my eyes drifting right to the refrigerator door. There was Clara's city bus schedule taped to the front with a school magnet, her handwritten note marking 6:40 a.m. in red ink. My daughter was out there at that very second, standing under the sweltering Georgia sun at a concrete bus stop because she had sold her car to keep her father alive. In that quiet moment, something inside me turned ice cold, sharp, and crystal clear. I didn't call Evelyn. I didn't call Mason. Why would I call people who had already made it abundantly clear that my life was worth less than a $1,200 bottle of bourbon? Instead, I dialed an old friend, Larry Foster, a real estate attorney who had handled my business back before the chemical spill, one of the very few people who hadn't abandoned me when the dust settled. "Larry," I said, my voice quiet but steady over the phone line. "It's Hank Sterling. I need you to pull an old file for me." Before Larry could even process the EPA release or the $15 million buyout, I uncovered another ugly truth that afternoon. While digging through our old records, Larry informed me of a notice sent to his office 3 weeks prior. Evelyn and Mason had privately retained a shady probate attorney to attempt a forced partition sale of our weathered home on Highway 16. They had been secretly gathering creditors to declare me financially incompetent while I was sick, planning to sell the house right out from under me, split the equity between themselves, and throw me into an assisted living facility. They were preparing to put me on the street, completely unaware that the very land they deemed worthless was about to make me richer than both of them combined. Larry Foster cleared his throat over the speakerphone, the heavy rustle of paper sliding across his desk, filling the quiet kitchen. "Hank, I'm holding the original blue ink copy right here," Larry said, his voice dropping into a measured, serious tone. "Do you remember the document Evelyn had me draft up back in 2019? The one Mason pushed so hard for." I closed my eyes, leaning back against the wooden chair in Clara's apartment. "I remember it real well, Larry," I replied softly. "Mason drove Evelyn down to your office himself. He told her it was the only smart play left." "That's right," Larry continued. "It's a formal partition and exchange agreement under Georgia domestic law. 5 years ago, Evelyn was terrified that your personal guarantees on the Fayette County land debt would bleed into her bank accounts or trigger a lien on the house on Highway 16. Mason convinced her that you were a sinking ship, so she legally severed her estate from yours. She took sole separate ownership of the house in her retirement, and she legally forced you to take 100% of those 80 acres of pine woods and every single dollar of liability attached to them as your sole separate property. Read me the exact wording, Larry," I commanded quietly. "Don't leave a single phrase out." Larry slid his glasses up his nose, his voice echoing clearly through the phone line. "Evelyn Sterling hereby waives, releases, surrenders, and forever discharges any and all present or future marital claim, equitable interest, or right of distribution in and to the real property located in Fayette County, including any proceeds, appreciation, or value realized therefrom, regardless of cause." Larry paused for a long second, letting the legal weight of those words settle in the air. "Hank, regardless of cause." Mason thought he was being a ruthless corporate strategist. He drafted that agreement to protect his mother from your failure. But under Georgia law, she signed away every legal right to that land forever. Whether it was toxic waste or a $15 million buyout, she doesn't own a single square inch of it. She locked herself out 5 years ago. A slow, cold clarity washed over my chest. His own trap had turned back on him. His clever legal move had come right back to strike his own family. "Larry," I said, my voice completely steady, "I want to accept Cornerstone's $15 million cash offer immediately, but I don't want a single dime of that money touching my personal bank account." Larry paused. "What are you planning, Hank?" "I want you to establish an irrevocable trust today," I instructed, leaning forward over Clara's kitchen table. "Name it the Clara Sterling Irrevocable Trust. The second cornerstone wires the funds, pay off every penny of my back taxes and medical debts, then transfer every remaining cent directly into that trust. Clara is the sole beneficiary and sole trustee. I want it airtight, Larry. I don't want Evelyn Mason or any high-priced Atlanta divorce lawyer to be able to touch a single penny." "And what about your car? A house for yourself?" Larry asked. "I want the trust to buy Clara a brand new vehicle. Something safe, comfortable, and top of the line," I answered, my eyes swelling with tears as I looked at her handwritten bus schedule on the fridge. "Then I want the trust to pay off the predatory payday lender she had to go to for my surgery deposit. Burn that 22% contract to ash today and find a quiet, beautiful 3-bedroom home in Noonan. Put the title directly in the trust." There was a long silence on the line. I could hear Larry breathing heavily. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Hank, I've been practicing law in Coweta County for 35 years. I watched that boy of yours walk in here 5 years ago like he owned the world, treating you like dirt on his shoe while Clara sold her car just to keep you breathing. I usually charge a 5% management fee for setting up a complex, irrevocable trust of this scale. Larry took a deep breath and continued, I'm waiving my fee entirely, Hank. Not a dime of commission. I'm taking the bare minimum filing cost. It's an honor to handle this for a real father and a daughter who proved what family actually means. We'll have the paperwork finalized by Friday. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet apartment as the afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, knowing the storm was coming. And for the first time in 10 years, I was completely ready for it. 8 days after I signed the final documents with Larry Foster, the peaceful quiet of Clara's small apartment was shattered. It was a humid Wednesday evening around 7 o'clock. Clara was sitting at her small kitchen table grading 4th grade spelling tests, while I was resting on the couch, slowly gaining my strength back. Suddenly, a heavy, aggressive fist began pounding on the front door, rattling the cheap wooden frame so violently it sounded like someone was trying to break it down. Hank, open this door right now. I know you're in there. It was Mason's voice. But it wasn't the smug, polished voice of the successful Atlanta broker celebrating over steak in Buckhead. It was frantic, frayed at the edges, and dripping with uncontrolled rage. Clara stood up immediately, her jaw set tight, and pulled the door open before he could kick it off its hinges. Mason pushed his way right past her without asking permission, wearing a rumpled designer dress shirt with his silk tie pulled loose and sweat soaking his collar. Right behind him stepped Evelyn, her arms crossed tightly, her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. Neither of them looked at me to ask how my lung surgery had gone. Neither of them looked at the surgical bandage still taped beneath my shirt. You think you're so slick, don't you, Dad? Mason roared, pacing back and forth across Clara's small living room rug like a caged animal. I checked the Georgia Commercial Real Estate Registry this morning. Cornerstone Commercial Development just filed a memorandum of deed on the Fayette County land. $15 million cash. You sold it behind our backs, didn't you? Evelyn's mouth literally dropped open, her eyes widening into dinner plates as she gasped. $15 million? Hank, is that true? I sat up slowly on the pull-out couch, keeping my breathing even and my expression dead calm. It closed 8 days ago, Evelyn, I replied quietly. 8 days ago? Mason screamed, his face flushing crimson as he lunged a step closer to me. You've had $15 million for over a week and you didn't call your own son? You hid a fortune from your own family while Mom drove a 10-year-old car. You sat on a mountain of gold just so you could hand it all to your favorite kid. You are a stingy, vindictive, cruel old man. Stingy? I let out a low, dry laugh, a humorless sound that cut right through his shouting. A man who refused his own father $3,500 for emergency cancer surgery is standing in his sister's apartment calling me stingy? Don't you dare play the victim, Hank? Evelyn snapped, stepping beside Mason, her finger pointing violently at my chest. I suffered 31 years with your failed business ideas. That money belongs to this family. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning. And Mason's high-rise litigation attorneys are filing an emergency injunction to freeze every bank account connected to that land deal. You hid marital assets, Hank. That's fraud. We're going to take half of everything you have. Mason stepped up to Clara's small laminate dining table, the exact same table where my daughter had slid her last $2,000 of cash across to save my life. He slammed his heavy fist down onto the wood with a deafening crack, shaking her teacher supplies onto the floor. My lawyers are going to bury you, Mason yelled straight into my face, his veins bulging against his neck. You won't have a single penny left by the time we're done with you in court. We're going to drag you through the mud until you're begging for mercy. That was the exact second something inside me snapped, seeing my arrogant, ungrateful son slam his fist down in the home of the 26-year-old girl who had sold her car and fainted at a bus stop under the Georgia sun to keep me alive was more than I could endure. I stood up off the couch so fast the room blurred. Despite the sharp pain pulling at my healing chest incision, I stepped right into Mason's personal space, pulled my right arm back, and delivered a crackling, open-handed slap straight across his face. Slap. The sound echoed like a gunshot off the small apartment walls. Mason stumbled backward, his head snapping sideways as he grabbed his reddening cheek in absolute shock. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely stunned that the quiet, broken warehouse driver he had mocked for 10 years had just laid a hand on him. Don't you ever slam your hand down in my daughter's home again? I growled, my voice dropping into an ice-cold register that made Evelyn freeze in her tracks. You want to talk about lawyers, Mason? Let's talk about lawyers. I reached slowly into my flannel shirt pocket, pulled out 2 folded sheets of legal paper, and tossed the first one onto the table directly in front of Evelyn. Read it, Evelyn, I commanded softly. It's the partition and exchange agreement you and Mason forced me to sign 5 years ago when you were terrified the bank was going to seize your house for my land debt. Mason told you it was a brilliant legal move to protect yourself from my failure. Evelyn picked up the paper with trembling hands. As her eyes scanned the highlighted text, the color drained completely from her face. Under Georgia domestic law, I explained, leaning over the table, you didn't just protect your house. You legally partitioned our marital estate and converted those 80 acres into my sole, separate property. You signed away every present and future legal claim to that land, regardless of cause. You locked yourself out 5 years ago, Evelyn. Your own son gave you the pen to sign away $15 million. Mason frantically grabbed the second document from the table, a certified bank statement bearing Clara's name. Look at the balance, Mason, I said, pointing at the printed numbers. $12.40. That's what was in your sister's account 3 weeks ago when she took out a payday loan at 22% interest to pay for my lung surgery while you were ordering $1,200 bottles of bourbon in Buckhead. The entire $15 million from Cornerstone Development was wired directly into the Clara Sterling Irrevocable Trust 5 days ago. It's fully protected, sealed, and completely beyond the reach of any court, any divorce proceeding, or any greedy lawyer you bring into Coweta County. I looked at my wife, then turned my eyes to my son, whose hand was still holding his burning cheek. You both divorced yourselves from this family a long time ago, I said, my voice quiet, final, and unwavering. Now get out of my daughter's house. 3 weeks after the door slammed shut behind Evelyn and Mason, the heavy, suffocating weight that had rested on my shoulders for over a decade finally dissolved into thin air. Life has a quiet, relentless way of balancing the scales when you stop trying to force the outcome yourself. As it turned out, the arrogant financial empire Mason had bragged about in Buckhead was built on a foundation of sand. When word broke out in the Atlanta financial circles about his public outburst, his questionable accounting practices, and the predatory legal maneuvers he had executed against his own father, his major institutional partners withdrew their backing overnight. His multi-million-dollar deal collapsed, leaving him drowning in corporate debt, high-interest personal loans, and a mountain of unpaid leases on luxury cars he could no longer afford. Evelyn didn't fare any better. Left alone in the weathered house on Highway 16 without my warehouse income to pay the property taxes or utility bills, and stripped of any legal claim to the $15 million buyout, her illusion of security crumbled. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the property, and within 21 days, she was forced to pack up 3 decades of belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and move into a cramped, noisy one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta, working part-time behind a retail counter just to keep the lights on. It was a chilly Sunday evening in mid-September when my phone vibrated against the wooden kitchen table. The caller ID displayed an unknown number from an Atlanta area code. I took a slow, deep breath, picked up the receiver, and pressed the answer button. Hank, please don't hang up, a weeping, frantic voice begged through the speaker. It was Evelyn, her southern drawl completely broken, slurred with alcohol, and heavy with despair. Beside her, I could hear Mason sobbing softly into the background, a defeated, ruined man whose vanity had swallowed him whole. Hank, we were wrong. We were so wrong about everything, Evelyn cried, her words tumbling over one another in a pathetic, desperate rush. Mason lost his firm, Hank. They took his car, they took his apartment, and the bank locked me out of the house. We have nowhere left to go. We're sitting here in an empty room with nothing. Please, Hank, you're a Christian man. You have $15 million in that trust. You can't leave your own family out on the street to starve. Tell us what we have to do to make this right. I sat quietly in my chair, listening to the heavy breathing of the woman who had traded her wedding ring for a Buckhead suit, and the son who had told me my life was worth less than a $1,200 bottle of bourbon. I felt no anger, no hatred, and no desire to gloat over their ruin. I just felt a profound, unwavering sense of peace. Evelyn, I said softly, my voice completely calm and level, I don't wish any harm on either of you, but you didn't just walk away from me when I was sick. You signed yourselves right out of this family 5 years ago when you thought I was worthless. The trust belongs to Clara, and decisions about this money are no longer mine to make. You built your life on arrogance, and now you have to live in the house you built. Hank, please! Mason squeaked into the line, his proud voice reduced to a high-pitched whimper. Dad, I'm your son. Good night, Evelyn. Good night, Mason, I said gently, slid my thumb across the screen and ended the call forever. By late September, autumn had arrived in Coweta County. The sweltering Georgia heat yielded to a cool, crisp breeze that rustled through the tall green pines. The Clara Sterling Irrevocable Trust had purchased a beautiful single-story 3-bedroom home set on 5 quiet acres of pine-wooded land just outside Noonan. It had a wraparound wooden porch, a brand-new hybrid SUV parked in the paved driveway for Clara, and no sagging gutters or rotting rails. That evening, as the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of amber, gold, and deep violet, Clara and I walked out onto the back balcony. We sat together in 2 sturdy wooden rocking chairs, wrapped in soft flannel jackets. Clara set a warm foil pan of homemade chicken and biscuits on the small table between us, heavy on the black pepper, just the way we liked it. Clara took a bite, looked out over the quiet forest, and smiled softly at me. "You know, Dad," she said, her voice filled with quiet affection, "you could have bought a mansion in Buckhead with all that money. You could have lived like a king." I looked at my 26-year-old daughter, the girl who had sold her Honda Civic, taken out a payday loan, and fainted under the hot sun just to keep her father breathing, and felt a warmth in my chest that no $15 million could ever buy. "Clara, baby," I told her, leaning over to squeeze her hand, "real wealth isn't about mansions or fancy titles. The greatest victory of my life isn't the money from that developer. It's sitting right here on this porch with the daughter who stood by me when I had nothing left to offer. That's the only victory that truly lasts." She squeezed my hand back, leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat together in perfect, unbreakable silence as the stars began to appear over the Georgia pines. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Hank Sterling's story today. If this journey of Southern grit, family resilience, and quiet justice touched your heart, please take a second to click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another audio drama. Drop a comment down below and let me know what city, state, or country you're listening from. I read and cherish every single one of your messages. Until next time, hold on to your values, protect the ones who truly love you, and take care of yourselves out there.